Welcome, dear listener. Find a comfortable place to rest and let your body grow heavy and still. Take a slow, gentle breath in and let it drift away. Tonight, we are going to travel together, softly and without hurry, far back through the corridors of time, to a world ancient beyond imagining, where clay and starlight gave birth to the first stories ever told. Let the sounds around you fade, and allow these quiet words to carry you gently into the deep past. From beneath the rubble of ancient Mesopotamia, uneven and weathered clay tablets have emerged, witnesses to a world that existed long before the biblical book of Genesis was ever set down. Baked hard by centuries of heat and the slow passage of time, these silent artifacts carry within them the outlines of creation stories that predate familiar religious traditions by thousands upon thousands of years. Imagine, if you will, the hands that first pressed those tiny wedge-shaped marks into soft clay, hands belonging to scribes who sat in lamplight, in rooms smelling of river mud and sesame oil, carefully inscribing words they believed would last forever. And they were right. The clay outlasted the scribes, outlasted their cities, outlasted the very language they spoke. What they preserve is remarkable. Accounts of a humanity that was not designed as the triumphant crown of divine labor, but rather as beings originally granted the gift of endless life. A gift that was quietly, deliberately taken away through the complex politics of heaven and the careful decisions of gods who thought in ways quite unlike our own. The Enuma Elish, named after its very first words, meaning when on high, opens a window onto a universe that did not begin with order, but with chaos. There were no neat separations of light and dark, land and sky. Instead, the first reality was a merging of two primordial waters. Apsu, the great freshwater ocean sleeping beneath the earth, and Tiamat, the vast and restless saltwater sea stretching across the surface of everything. These were not mere symbols or philosophical abstractions. In the Sumerian understanding of the world, they were living divinities, the first and most ancient of all divine beings, whose mingling gave rise to the earliest generation of gods. From their union were born Lahmu and Lahamu, and after them came Anshar and Kashar, representing the curved horizons where heaven meets earth, the great arching boundaries of existence itself. Picture those two primordial oceans as they might have appeared to ancient eyes. One dark and still, one vast and restless, their currents intertwining in the lightless deep. The Sumerians who first composed these verses had lived all their lives between two great rivers, and they knew water in a way that people of drier lands could not. Water was life and danger simultaneously. It rose in spring and consumed entire villages. It receded in summer and left behind the rich black silt from which crops grew. It was, in the deepest sense they knew, the substance from which everything emerged. So when they reached back to imagine the very beginning of all things, it was water they found there, dark, deep, and full of divine potential. Archaeological work at the ancient city of Sippar has uncovered numerous copies of the Enuma Elish, and careful study of these versions reveals something quietly fascinating. The story shifted and evolved across the centuries, details altered, emphasis adjusted, yet the fundamental architecture of the narrative remained intact. Central to that structure is a moment of divine irritation. The younger gods, born from the union of these primordial waters, grew lively and restless. They moved through existence with noise and energy, disturbing the deep rest of Apsu, who desired only stillness. This small detail carries enormous weight for understanding Sumerian cosmology. The universe in this tradition is governed by principles of balance and hierarchy, and any disruption of that balance, even the joyful noise of younger divine beings, carries consequences. Imbalance always leads to conflict, and conflict always leads to transformation. The scribes who copied the Enuma Elish at Sippar did their work in rooms adjacent to the great temple complex there, in buildings specifically designed for the training of those who would preserve sacred knowledge. We can imagine them, young men seated in rows, each with a fresh tablet of clay balanced on their knees, copying the ancient words with the focused attention of students who understood that they were handling something precious. The variations between different copies of the text are small, a phrase adjusted here, an epithet added there, suggesting that each generation of scribes brought their own understanding to the material while treating the core narrative with deep reverence. These were not careless copyists, they were custodians. The Atrahasis epic, recovered in fragments across many different Mesopotamian locations, adds further richness to this unfolding picture. Where the Enuma Elish concerns itself with the succession of divine generations, the Atrahasis turns its attention to the relationship between gods and the humans they would eventually create, and in doing so, it reveals something unexpectedly practical about the divine mind. The gods known as the Anunnaki, having established their dominion over the cosmos, found themselves burdened with labor. They dug the great riverbeds of the Tigris and Euphrates with their own hands. They maintained irrigation canals, carried earth, and performed the endless physical work required to sustain the world they governed. This labor wore upon them. The tablets preserve their complaints with moving specificity. For 40 years, the lesser Anunnaki had carried baskets of earth. Their hands had grown rough and calloused. Their backs ached. The text even offers precise numbers. 1,200 years of toil before the breaking point arrived. Whether we understand these figures as literal chronological records or as the expression of mythological time, they speak to something real about the weight of endless work. A feeling perhaps not so different from what any weary soul might know, even now, lying quietly in the darkness, the day's labors finally set aside. There is something unexpectedly tender in these divine complaints. The gods of ancient Mesopotamia were not remote and untouchable figures, serene in their perfection. They grew tired. They grew frustrated. They negotiated with one another and sometimes lost their tempers. They made decisions they would later come to regret. In this way, the Sumerian theological imagination gave its divine beings a quality of lived experience that made them comprehensible to the humans who worshipped them. The universe was governed not by cold, abstract forces, but by personalities, vast and powerful, yes, but personalities nonetheless, subject to something recognizable as feeling. High above this labor, at the very apex of the divine order, stood Anu, whose name carries within it the simple, vast meaning of sky or heaven. Excavations at the ancient city of Uruk have uncovered the foundation stones of his great temple, the Anu Ziggurat, whose origins reach back to the 4th millennium before our common era. The building's orientation was carefully aligned with the movements of stars, a reminder that Anu's authority encompassed not only the affairs of gods and mortals, but the turning of the heavens themselves. He was the source from which all legitimate power flowed, the one whose decisions shaped the laws governing existence across multiple layers of reality. The famous Sumerian king list, copies of which have been found at Nippur, Lhasa, and elsewhere, opens with the words, "After the kingship descended from heaven," a phrase that points directly back to Anu's cosmic authority over both divine and earthly governance. The Anu ziggurat at Uruk rose in stages, each terrace constructed of millions of mud bricks fired in kilns that burned night and day for years. To stand at its summit, in the quiet before dawn, watching the great wheel of stars rotate overhead. This was understood as standing at the axis of the world, at the point where earthly and heavenly realms came closest to touching. The priests who maintained this sacred space were trained from childhood in the observation of celestial phenomena, learning to read the movements of planets and the appearances of constellations as expressions of divine will. For them, astronomy was not merely science, but conversation. The heavens speaking in a language that patient and disciplined minds could learn to understand. Beneath Anu in the hierarchy stood Enlil, keeper of wind, air, and earth, the one who took divine decisions and translated them into action. His primary cult center at Nippur endured for more than 3,000 years, an extraordinary span of religious continuity that speaks to his central importance throughout Mesopotamian history. Yet Enlil's character, as it emerges from the tablets, is not gentle. He is the force behind floods and droughts, the stern voice that enforces cosmic order regardless of the cost to individual beings caught in its path. The Sumerian flood myth, preserved in several versions, presents him as the one who decreed the Great Deluge, not out of personal malice, but out of the cold, impersonal logic of maintaining universal balance. Nippur's archaeological layers support this picture of ongoing religious devotion to this demanding deity, with the Enlil temple complex growing more elaborate through successive centuries, and cuneiform archives preserving thousands of religious and administrative texts that together form our richest single source for understanding Mesopotamian religious life. Enlil was the wind that came before the storm, the pressure drop that animals felt in their bones before the sky darkened. In the flatlands of ancient Mesopotamia, where there were no mountains to shelter behind, and the horizon extended unbroken in every direction, the wind was the most immediate expression of forces beyond human control. It came from everywhere and went where it chose. It leveled fields of grain in minutes. It carried the seeds of disease. It also carried the rain that ended drought, the cool breath that relieved the killing summer heat. Enlil was all of this simultaneously, capricious, necessary, and fundamentally indifferent to individual human welfare. Completing this divine triumvirate was Enki, whose name is also known in later Akkadian sources. Enki's domain encompassed fresh water, wisdom, craft, and magic, elements that together describe the foundations of civilization itself. His primary cult center at Eridu carries a special weight in Sumerian cosmological thought. Eridu was considered the first city, the place where divine civilization had taken its earliest root in the world. Archaeological evidence honors this claim. Excavations there have uncovered occupation layers reaching back to the 6th millennium before our era, making Eridu one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in all of Mesopotamia. The Temple of Enki at Eridu was rebuilt again and again through successive generations, each iteration more elaborate than the last, tracing in stone and mud brick the growing reverence in which this god was held. The tablets describe Enki's home as the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, which served as the source of all wisdom and magical knowledge. This was not purely symbolic language. Sumerian hydraulic engineering was deeply sophisticated, and the texts attribute its principles directly to Enki's teaching. His association with craftsmanship appears throughout the literature. He is described as working with his own hands, as understanding the properties of materials, as knowing the precise conditions required for complex creative processes. He was, in short, both the divine architect and the divine craftsman. One can almost see Enki in the imagination of his ancient worshippers, a figure who moved through the world with a craftsman's attentiveness, noticing how clay responded differently depending on its moisture content, how metal changed color in the fire, how the angle of an irrigation channel could make the difference between a field that flooded and one that flourished. His wisdom was not the abstract wisdom of philosophy, but the deep, practical knowledge of someone who had spent long ages in close attention to the materials of the world. And it was this quality, this patient, attentive engagement with earthly matter, that made him humanity's most consistent divine advocate. He understood what had been made because he had made it, and understanding it, he could not simply discard it. The tensions between these three great figures, Anu's distant ultimate authority, Enlil's active and often harsh executive power, and Enki's protective wisdom, create the cosmic drama within which humanity's story unfolds. It is a drama of competing values, of differing understandings of what power means and what responsibility it carries. These tensions would never be fully resolved. They persisted across millennia of Mesopotamian theology, resurfacing in different forms in each new generation's religious literature, because they reflect something genuinely unresolvable about the nature of authority over conscious beings. When the lesser Anunnaki finally reached their limit and could no longer endure their endless labor, they did not quietly submit. The Atrahasis epic describes their rebellion in vivid detail. They gathered in secret, formed a common resolve, and burned their tools in a fire bright enough to illuminate the heavens. They threw down the baskets they had carried for so long, and they marched together toward Enlil's temple at Nippur. Their grievances were specific and deeply felt. They had excavated the riverbeds, dug the irrigation canals, and carried earth without rest, each carrying 60 measures of burden daily from first light to darkness. The tablets measure their suffering in centuries, divine hands grown hard, divine backs bent, divine natures diminished by the grinding weight of physical toil. The image of gods burning their tools is one of the most unexpectedly human moments in all of ancient literature. The act of destroying one's instruments of labor, the baskets, the digging tools, the implements that had defined the shape of countless days, is a gesture of absolute refusal. A statement that no work worth doing could be worth this. And when the fire leapt up, visible against the dark sky, something had changed that could not be unchanged. The divine hierarchy would have to respond. The question was only how. Enlil's response was immediate and revealing of the rigid structure governing divine society. Rather than seeking dialogue, he summoned Anu from the highest heaven and Enki from the depths of the Abzu, convening an emergency session of the Supreme Divine Council. The lesser gods surrounded his temple, demanding relief, but offering no solution to the fundamental problem. If they ceased their labor, who would maintain the cosmic order they had been sustaining? The deliberations that followed were practical rather than philosophical. The Divine Council did not debate abstract justice. They addressed a labor shortage with the same administrative pragmatism that characterized Mesopotamian governance at every level. Anu proposed crushing the rebellion by force. Enlil suggested creating some form of automatic mechanism for the necessary work. But it was Enki who proposed the solution that would reshape the nature of existence itself. The creation of an entirely new category of being. Creatures intelligent enough to understand complex tasks and adapt to changing circumstances, yet designed with fundamental limitations that would keep them within appropriate boundaries. The emergency session of the Divine Council, as described in the tablets, has the quality of a late-night administrative meeting, where exhausted officials wrestle with a problem that has no good solution. Anu's proposal to crush the rebellion by force was practical in one sense. The supreme deities certainly possessed the power to do it, but it would accomplish nothing. The work still needed to be done, and if the workers were destroyed, the problem simply reasserted itself in a more urgent form. Enlil's suggestion of an automatic mechanism was visionary in its way, but the tablets give no indication that the technology for such a thing existed, even in the divine realm. It was Enki's proposal that cut through the impasse, not because it was simple, but because it was genuinely new. What followed was a creative process described in the tablets with remarkable specificity. Enki proposed using clay from the Abzu, not ordinary clay, but material that had absorbed divine emanations across cosmic ages, making it capable of sustaining consciousness when properly activated. But the animating element, the spark that would make these new beings truly conscious, came from a more startling source. The Divine Council chose to sacrifice one of the rebellious gods, Geshtu-e, described as possessing intelligence beyond his station, possibly the rebellion's leader, and from his living blood, carefully extracted to preserve the consciousness within it, Enki drew the essential divine component. He mixed this blood with the sacred clay in precise proportions, recorded with mathematical exactness on the tablets. 7 measures of clay to 1 measure of divine blood, combined under specific stellar configurations, when the moon was dark, and the constellation of the Plough dominated the night sky. The mother goddess, Ninhursag, then shaped these materials, performing the incantations and ritual gestures necessary to bind divine essence to clay matrix. From this sacred workshop came not single individuals, but 7 pairs, 14 beings created simultaneously, so that humanity could multiply from the very beginning. The mother goddess worked in silence, broken only by the soft sounds of her hands in clay and the words of the binding incantations. The tablets preserve fragments of these words, rhythmic, repetitive phrases that were understood as having creative power in themselves, as if language and reality were not separate things, but 2 faces of the same substance. When Ninhursag spoke the words of binding, she was not describing what was happening. She was causing it to happen. This understanding of language as creative force would persist through thousands of years of Mesopotamian religious practice, finding echoes in traditions far beyond the river valleys where it originated. The tablets offer physical descriptions of these first humans that differ significantly from modern human beings. They were larger in stature. Their lifespans stretched across centuries rather than decades. Their bones were denser, their teeth stronger, their hair slower growing. Most significantly, they possessed what Sumerian texts call the melamu, a visible divine radiance, an aura of luminous essence that marked them as beings unlike any other on Earth. They were simultaneously earthly and divine, mortal in their physical form, yet carrying within them an immortal spark. The melamu is described in various tablets as something between light and presence. Not exactly a glow visible to ordinary eyes, but a quality of being that others could perceive and respond to. Animals grew calm in the presence of someone carrying a strong melamu. Storms seemed to quiet. Other humans felt drawn to these individuals in ways they could not entirely explain. The melamu was not simply decoration, a divine aesthetic flourish applied to human beings for no functional reason. It was the outward expression of the inner divine essence, the signature of the Abzu clay, and the sacred blood that had gone into the making of these first people, still visible in the world as a kind of luminous remainder of the creative act. The divine component embedded within humanity is described throughout Mesopotamian literature with a remarkable consistency and philosophical depth. The Sumerian word Zi, often translated simply as soul or life force, encompasses far more than these translations suggest. It represents the animating principle that distinguishes living consciousness from inert matter. But more specifically, it describes the divine component that enables memory, rational thought, and awareness of the self. Temple archives at Nippur show that Zi was considered transferable under certain circumstances, which explains Mesopotamian beliefs about divine inspiration, possession, and communication with the spirits of ancestors. The related concept of Giddim refers to what persists after death. Not a disembodied ghost in the modern sense, but the divine essence returning toward its source while retaining individual memory and the accumulated experience of earthly existence. Tablets from various periods contain detailed instructions for maintaining communication with the Giddim, suggesting that death was understood not as absolute separation, but as a transformation in the nature of the relationship between the divine spark and its earthly experiences. There is something deeply comforting in this understanding of death. The idea that the essential self does not simply cease, but returns, carrying everything it has known and loved and learned back towards the source from which it came. The Giddim tablets speak to this with a quiet matter-of-factness that suggests the Sumerians found genuine consolation in the belief. The dead were not simply gone. They had transformed. And with the right knowledge and the right rituals, the living could still reach across that transformation and find them there, changed but present, familiar in their essential nature, even across the boundary of death. The term Immu, meaning essence or fundamental nature, appears frequently in creation texts to describe the unchangeable core of human identity, derived directly from divine blood. Unlike Zi, which could be influenced by external forces, Immu constituted the irreducible divine element that made humans genuinely different from all other earthly creatures. This concept explains why Mesopotamian texts consistently portray humans as capable of challenging even the gods. Within them dwelt something that was, in its deepest nature, divine. The process of binding divine consciousness to a clay matrix required sophisticated techniques described in the tablets with the care one might give to a delicate craft. Temperature was critical. The clay and blood mixture had to be maintained at the warmth of a living body throughout the entire shaping process, requiring Enki to work swiftly before the divine essence could dissipate. Timing was equally important, tied to specific celestial alignments when the boundaries between divine and earthly realms grew thin. Astronomical texts from later periods preserve calculations for identifying these optimal moments, suggesting that the creation process was understood as potentially repeatable under the right conditions. The emphasis on temperature in these creation accounts is striking. The warmth of a living body, that specific intimate heat that we all carry within us, the warmth we feel in another person's hand, the warmth that leaves a body when life departs. This was understood as the condition necessary for the divine spark to take hold. Not the fierce heat of a kiln, which would destroy the delicate structure of the divine essence. Not the coolness of water or stone, which would prevent the binding from occurring at all. The precise living warmth of a body in which consciousness already resided. Enki worked with his own warmth as both tool and measure, understanding that to create life, one had to bring the materials to exactly the temperature of life itself. And yet the relationship between these immortal new beings and their divine creators grew complicated almost immediately. Enki, as their creator, developed what the tablets describe as a paternal relationship with humanity. He taught them agriculture, writing, and mathematics. He provided them with knowledge that enhanced their effectiveness while enriching the texture of their existence. Enlil, by contrast, viewed humans primarily as tools for cosmic maintenance, effective when functioning within their intended parameters, problematic when they exceeded them. Anu remained distant from these earthly concerns, the ultimate source of authority, but rarely its direct instrument. The relationship between Enki and the humans he had created had the quality of a parent who has made something more complex than intended, and finds to their surprise that this complexity is not a flaw, but the most interesting thing about the creation. Enki watched humans discover fire independently, develop it, learn to control it, and where Enlil saw a potential threat, Enki saw the divine essence expressing itself. He watched humans begin to sing, to tell stories, to decorate their clay vessels with patterns that served no practical purpose but pleased the eye. He watched them grieve their dead and care for their sick and sacrifice their own comfort for the welfare of their children. In each of these things, he recognized something of himself, and he could not bring himself to regard these beings as merely functional. Enlil's complaints began to accumulate as the immortal human population grew. The Atrahasis epic describes his central grievance with unusual detail. The expanding population of immortal humans created what the tablets call excessive noise. Not simply auditory disturbance, but a spiritual disruption caused by millions of immortal beings simultaneously drawing upon divine energy to sustain their endless lifespans. Each human, carrying embedded divine essence, required ongoing connection to the cosmic life force. As their numbers multiplied, continuously without the natural correction of death, the drain on celestial resources grew beyond what the Divine Council had anticipated or planned for. Administrative calculations preserved on Babylonian temple tablets show the mathematics of this problem with striking clarity. The original 14 humans had multiplied to several thousand within their first centuries of existence. Unlike mortal populations balanced by death, immortal humans accumulated without limit, each generation adding to, rather than replacing the one before it. At their reproductive rate, projections showed the population reaching 1 million individuals within 2 millennia. A demand on divine resources that the Anunnaki's cosmic infrastructure could not indefinitely sustain. There is something poignant about this accounting. The Divine Council seated around their assembly, tablet scribes recording the numbers, the projections climbing across the surface of the clay. What had begun as a solution to the labor shortage had become, through the simple mathematics of immortal reproduction, a new kind of problem. The 14 original humans were the seed of this difficulty, but they could hardly be blamed for it. They had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had been fruitful. They had multiplied. They had filled the earth with their labor and their children, and their endless accumulating presence. It was the design itself, Enlil argued, that had been flawed from the beginning. Enlil's initial responses followed established patterns for managing cosmic imbalances. Tablets from Mari describe his first intervention, a series of targeted plagues designed to reduce human numbers without destroying the species entirely. These were not random diseases, but carefully engineered afflictions affecting specific populations and age groups. Yet they proved ineffective. The divine essence within humans granted them natural resistance to supernatural disease, and Enki compounded Enlil's frustration by providing human physicians with knowledge that enabled effective treatment of these artificially created conditions. The human physicians who received Enki's healing knowledge worked with herbs gathered at specific phases of the moon, with mineral preparations whose properties had been revealed to them in dreams. with techniques of touch and pressure that addressed not just the physical symptoms of illness, but the spiritual disturbance underlying them. Their healing was understood as a form of restoration, bringing the patient's divine essence back into proper alignment with the cosmic forces that sustained it. A skilled healer was therefore both a practical clinician and a spiritual technician, and the best practitioners were equally accomplished in both dimensions of their art. A second intervention followed: manipulation of weather systems and river flows to create famine conditions across populated regions. This initially showed more promise, forcing human communities to consolidate around major waterways where they could be more easily managed. But again, Enki countered the measure, teaching agricultural innovations that enabled human survival even through severe environmental challenge. The innovations Enki provided were practical and specific. New methods for storing grain that prevented spoilage, techniques for irrigating fields that remained productive even during periods of low river flow, knowledge of which wild plants could supplement cultivated crops during shortage years. These were not miraculous interventions, but the kind of deep agricultural wisdom that accumulated over long generations of attentive farming. Wisdom that Enki, who had watched the earth since its formation, possessed in abundance and shared without hesitation. Enlil watched these interventions with growing frustration. Each time he tightened the conditions of human existence, Enki found a way to loosen them again. The theological conflict between Enlil and Enki deepened with each failed intervention. At its core was a fundamental philosophical disagreement about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to rights. Enlil maintained that humans existed solely for divine service, possessing no claims beyond their assigned function. Any behavior exceeding their original parameters constituted rebellion, requiring correction or elimination. Enki argued differently. The divine essence embedded within humans during their creation granted them a form of limited divine status. Since they carried genuine consciousness derived from divine blood, they shared certain fundamental characteristics with their creators, including the capacity for growth, learning, and self-determination. Conscious beings, he insisted, possessed inherent dignity that limited what could acceptably be done to them, regardless of their origin. This disagreement between Enlil and Enki was not merely theological. It was personal, in the way that disagreements between beings who have known each other across vast ages of time become personal. They had stood together at the creation of the cosmos. They had served alongside each other in the divine council for longer than human civilizations could measure. And yet, on this fundamental question, what obligations a creator bears toward a conscious creation, they stood in complete and irreconcilable opposition. The tablets preserve moments when their debates grew heated, when the formal language of divine assembly gave way to something rawer and more urgent. These were not abstract disputants. They were beings who cared, intensely and differently, about the world they shared. This dispute found its most consequential expression in Enki's establishment of mystery schools. Institutions where selected humans received advanced training in divine knowledge. Tablets from various Mesopotamian sites reference these schools using terms like houses of wisdom and temples of secret learning. The curriculum, reconstructed from fragmentary references, included advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, metallurgy, and techniques for enhancing human capabilities through controlled use of the divine spark within human consciousness. Students learn to extend their natural lifespans, to perceive divine presence directly, and to perform limited operations using their inherited divine power. The selection of students for these schools was itself a sophisticated process. Teachers looked for specific qualities, not merely intelligence, but a particular quality of attention, the ability to hold a complex idea in mind for a long time without distorting it, to sit with uncertainty without rushing toward premature resolution. They looked for emotional stability combined with genuine curiosity, for the capacity to learn from experience without becoming rigidly attached to the lessons already learned. These were rare qualities, and when they appeared together in a single person, the mystery school teachers recognized them with quiet satisfaction. Here, they thought, is someone who can bear what we have to teach. These schools created a new category of human that alarmed the divine council deeply. Enhanced individuals, trained in divine knowledge and capable of manipulating their own essence, represented something unprecedented. Created beings who could maintain themselves independently of divine favor and potentially resist divine authority through their enhanced capabilities. Unlike the Igigi rebellion, which had involved beings created as gods from the beginning, human resistance to divine control would represent something entirely new in cosmic history. A category error, a thing that the existing order of the universe had no framework for accommodating. The mystery school graduates were recognizable to those who knew what to look for. They moved through the world with a quality of ease that differed from ordinary human confidence. Not the ease of someone who has never been challenged, but the ease of someone who has been challenged many times and has learned, through practice and discipline, how to remain centered within the challenge. Their melamu, the visible divine radiance that all humans carried to some degree, burned more steadily in them, less subject to the fluctuations caused by fear or anger or grief. People were drawn to them. Children followed them through the streets. Animals settled in their presence. They were not trying to attract attention. They simply had a quality that attention naturally followed. The crisis reached its decisive moment when observatory priests at Borsippa detected something unprecedented in the night sky. The constellation patterns that had remained stable for millennia were shifting. Specific star groups were dimming, while others brightened beyond their normal luminosity. Careful analysis revealed that the changes were not random. They corresponded precisely to concentrations of enhanced human populations on the Earth below. Mystery school graduates, drawing divine energy directly from stellar sources rather than relying solely on the terrestrial essence embedded in their physical forms, were creating measurable fluctuations in the energy grid connecting various star systems. Enlil presented this evidence to an emergency divine council session, and its impact was decisive. Mathematical projections showed that if human energy consumption continued to grow at its current rate, critical stellar systems could be drained within several thousand years, threatening the stability of divine civilization across multiple worlds. The observatory priests at Borsippa had been watching the stars for generations by the time they noticed the first anomalies. Their records were meticulous, clay tablets stacked in careful order in fireproofed archive rooms, each one recording the precise position and brightness of specific celestial objects on specific nights over decades and centuries. It was only by comparing these long records that the pattern became visible. Not a dramatic change, but a slow, steady drift in the brightness of certain star groups, so gradual that any single generation of observers would have missed it entirely. It was the accumulated patience of many generations of careful watchers that finally made the invisible visible. The flood solution emerged from this crisis as the only intervention capable of addressing all aspects of the human problem at once. Complete, coordinated, and final, a global deluge would eliminate the entire enhanced human network while preserving sufficient genetic material to restart civilization under more carefully controlled conditions. The technical execution required unprecedented cooperation between divine departments. Enlil redirected global weather patterns, concentrating oceanic moisture into massive continuous storm systems. Enki manipulated underground aquifers and river systems to maximize flooding across populated areas. Even Anu contributed, adjusting gravitational forces influencing tidal patterns and ocean currents. The preparation for the flood was itself a vast operation, requiring coordination across divine departments that rarely worked in close conjunction. The atmospheric manipulation alone involved redirecting weather systems across thousands of miles of ocean, pulling moisture from regions of high evaporation and steering it toward a single great convergence over the inhabited lands. The celestial adjustments required precise calculations. The gravitational influences involved were subtle, and a miscalculation could produce effects lasting far longer than intended. The divine administrators responsible for these systems worked with the focus of engineers managing a delicate and potentially catastrophic intervention, knowing that once the process began, it could not be easily reversed. The flood accounts preserved across multiple independent sources, the Sumerian flood story, the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the narrative within the Epic of Gilgamesh, agree with remarkable consistency on its duration. 7 days and 7 nights of rainfall so intense that daylight was obscured and normal life became impossible. Geological evidence from across the Middle East supports the occurrence of catastrophic flooding during the early Holocene period, with sediment layers indicating water levels far exceeding anything in recorded history. 7 days and 7 nights. The tablets return to this number across different versions and different centuries of composition, as if some scribes had access to the same original account and preserved its specific details with unusual fidelity. The number itself, 7, carried deep significance in Mesopotamian cosmological thinking, associated with completion, with the full cycle of divine action. For the flood to last exactly 7 days and nights was not coincidental but meaningful. It was the minimum span of time required for a complete divine intervention, a full turning of the cosmic wheel from initiation to conclusion. Utnapishtim, or Atrahasis depending on the source, was selected as the sole human survivor with careful deliberation. He served as a temple administrator in the city of Shuruppak, responsible for maintaining genealogical records and information about human bloodline diversity. His position made him ideally suited to preserve the optimal genetic foundation for post-flood human reconstruction. And crucially, his administrative role had kept him away from mystery school training, ensuring that he possessed basic human capabilities without the enhanced powers that had made his contemporaries so problematic. Shuruppak was a city of considerable size and sophistication by the time of the flood, with organized storage systems, trained administrators, and a scribal school where the city's record keepers were educated. Utnapishtim had spent his life in this world of careful measurement and recorded information, grain tallied in standard vessels, workers counted by name, genealogies traced across multiple generations with methodical precision. He was, in the deepest sense, a keeper of records. And what Enki needed, in preparing for the flood, was exactly this. Someone who would understand the necessity of preservation, who would approach the terrible task before him with the same careful attention he brought to his administrative work. Enki's warning to Utnapishtim about the coming flood is preserved in multiple sources with consistent and highly specific details. The instructions included precise dimensions for constructing the survival vessel, detailed lists of living creatures and supplies to be preserved, and exact timing for beginning the preservation process. These specifications reflect sophisticated understanding of ecological requirements for restarting civilization after total environmental destruction. The vessel itself, as described in the tablets, required engineering techniques that exceeded the ordinary capabilities of the period. Multi-deck internal structure, sophisticated loading systems, and the use of bitumen for waterproofing all suggest access to technical knowledge of considerable depth. The construction of this vessel took time that Utnapishtim did not fully have. He worked without explaining his reasons to his neighbors, who watched with curiosity and sometimes with mockery as the structure rose on the dry land of Shuruppak. He selected his workers carefully, paying them well and saying nothing about the purpose of their labor. He gathered the living creatures with equal care. Pairs of animals whose diversity would provide the foundation for repopulated ecosystems, seeds of every cultivated plant, cuttings from fruit trees, samples of grain varieties developed across generations of agricultural experimentation. He was not building a boat. He was building a library of living things. The psychological aftermath of the flood left lasting marks on the Divine Council. Even Enlil, who had been its strongest advocate, reportedly experienced something approaching grief when confronted with the totality of what had been lost. Civilizations that had taken millennia to develop, artistic achievements, accumulated knowledge, cultural complexity irretrievably gone. Enki's grief was more openly expressed in the tablets. His anger at the thoroughness of the destruction, his determination that nothing like this would ever happen again. The silence after the flood was a particular kind of silence. The silence of a world where the sounds that had always been there were suddenly absent. No distant voices from neighboring settlements. No dogs barking at the edge of the village. No children. The water receded slowly, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris. The flattened remains of structures that had stood for centuries. The scattered possessions of populations that no longer existed. Utnapishtim came out of his vessel into this silence and understood, in a way that no description could have prepared him for, what the word ending actually meant. The post-flood reconstruction of human civilization proceeded under fundamentally altered parameters. The new humans descended from Utnapishtim's lineage possessed the same basic genetic structure as their immortal predecessors, but with crucial modifications. Cuneiform medical texts describe these changes as involving a binding of the divine spark within human consciousness, preventing direct access to cosmic energy sources, while maintaining sufficient divine essence to enable complex thought, creativity, and genuine inner life. The mechanism required not a single intervention, but ongoing divine maintenance. Regular renewal ceremonies, where human communities received fresh infusions of carefully limited divine energy, while simultaneously having their cosmic connections restricted. The gradual reduction in human lifespans, documented in post-flood genealogies, reflects this systematic process. Each generation received slightly less divine energy than the one before, creating a controlled decline in human longevity that would eventually stabilize at levels the Divine Council deemed safe. This process took centuries to complete, which is why the immediate post-flood rulers in the Sumerian king list still enjoyed lifespans measured in hundreds of years, while later generations experienced the shortened lives characteristic of historical human populations. The people who lived through this gradual reduction, the long-lived generations of the post-flood world, still carrying more divine energy than their descendants would, were aware, at some level, that something was changing. The tablets preserve accounts of elderly people in these transitional generations who spoke of a different quality to the world in their childhoods. a different quality to the light, a different feeling in the body, as if existence had been slightly less constrained, the boundaries between self and world slightly more permeable. Whether these accounts preserved genuine memories of reduced divine energy, or simply reflected the universal human tendency to idealize the past, cannot be determined with certainty. But the consistency with which these descriptions appear across different sources and different periods suggests they may reflect something real. The Sumerian king list itself has puzzled scholars since its discovery in the early 20th century. Multiple copies found at Nippur, Larsa, and elsewhere record the reigns of antediluvian rulers whose lifespans stretch across tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Algar for 36,000. Enmenluana of Sippar for 43,200. These figures are not presented as mythological or symbolic, but recorded with the same matter-of-fact precision used for historical rulers whose reigns can be verified through independent sources. Analysis of the mathematical patterns underlying these numbers reveals sophisticated base 60 calculations consistent with Sumerian mathematical practices, many expressible as multiples of the sacred number 3600, a SAR in Sumerian mathematics. This precision suggests that the scribes compiling the king list were working from source materials they considered historically accurate. After the flood, the pattern changes dramatically. Jushur of Kish ruled for 1,200 years, Kulaba for 960, Nangishlishma for 670. And so the numbers continue their steady, systematic descent, each generation diminished slightly from the one before, until lifespans approximate the historical norms we recognize today. This is not the sudden transformation of mythology, but the gradual curve of a controlled process, a divine policy being implemented across centuries, measurable in the precise numerical language that Mesopotamian scribes used for everything they considered real and important. The mathematical precision of these records is itself remarkable. In a tradition where numbers carried both practical and sacred significance, the choice to record antediluvian lifespans in multiples of 3,600 was not arbitrary. The SAR, the Great Cycle, the cosmic completion, was the unit that connected earthly time to divine time, the measure by which human existence could be understood in relation to the vast rhythms of celestial movement. By recording the reigns of the earliest kings in SAR multiples, the scribes of the king list were saying something specific. These were lives lived at the scale of cosmic time. Lives whose duration resonated with the turning of the heavens themselves. Similar patterns appear in other ancient traditions. Egyptian records preserved by Manetho describe divine rulers who reigned for thousands of years before giving way to human dynasties with conventional lifespans. The biblical genealogies in Genesis record patriarchs living for centuries: Adam for 930 years, Noah for 950, Abraham for 175, with a systematic reduction across generations that mirrors the Mesopotamian pattern. These parallel traditions, developing independently across different cultures, suggest widespread preservation of memories about humanity's original longevity. The fact that this pattern appears across cultures that developed independently, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Hebrew, gives it a weight that no single tradition could carry alone. Something must account for this convergence. The most conservative explanation is that all three traditions drew on a common pool of very ancient stories. Stories that were already old when the first professional scribes began to write them down. stories that had been passed from generation to generation in the oral tradition for so long that no single point of origin could be identified. Whatever their ultimate source, they all pointed in the same direction, toward a time when human existence had been longer, richer in divine connection, differently bounded than the existence we know. The figure of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh illuminates what the transition from immortal to mortal existence actually meant for an individual who had lived through it. His immortality was not inherent, but granted by divine decree, specifically through the combined action of all three supreme deities after his survival of the flood. Anu provided the breath of eternal life. Enlil granted protection from disease and aging. Enki bestowed the wisdom necessary to sustain immortal existence without losing human consciousness. The ritual took place at the confluence of fresh and salt water, the symbolic boundary between mortal and divine realms. But Utnapishtim's subsequent existence, as described in the tablets, was not simple joy. He retained his human emotional attachments while gaining freedom from aging and death. He grieved the loss of his pre-flood companions. He struggled to find meaning in existence that stretched across geological ages. His story suggests that immortality, while deeply desirable, created psychological challenges that the original human design had been intended to address. Or perhaps that human consciousness, formed for engagement with mortal life, found endless existence difficult to inhabit with equanimity. Utnapishtim, at the edge of the cosmic ocean, looking out across water that extended beyond the horizon in every direction. This is one of the great solitary figures of ancient literature. He had been given everything a human could desire. He would never grow old. He would never die. He had been placed beyond the reach of the common fate. And yet the tablets describe him with a quality of melancholy that no amount of divine favor could dissolve. The people he had loved were gone. The world he had known was gone. He had survived into a future that was not his, carrying memories of a past that no one else could share. Immortality, in this portrayal, was not a paradise, but a form of exile. The plant of youth that Utnapishtim reveals to Gilgamesh provides additional insight into the mechanisms governing human longevity. Located at the floor of the cosmic ocean, it could restore youth to aged humans, but its effects were temporary, unless consumed regularly, implying that maintaining extended lifespan required ongoing access to specific substances or conditions. Gilgamesh retrieves it through dangerous underwater effort, only to have it stolen from him by a serpent while he sleeps. The loss feels less like accident than inevitability. Humanity's access to immortality, once severed, could not so easily be restored. The serpent that takes the plant of youth from Gilgamesh as he sleeps beside the water, this creature appears in myth after myth across the ancient world, always associated with transformation, with the shedding of skins, with the mystery of renewal that humans observe in nature but cannot themselves access. The Mesopotamian serpent that steals the plant of youth does not represent evil in the later theological sense. It represents something more fundamental. The forces of the natural world that follow their own logic regardless of human need, that take what they require without malice but without mercy. Gilgamesh wakes to find the plant gone, the water disturbed, a cast-off serpent skin lying on the bank, evidence of a transformation that has occurred beyond his awareness, beyond his power to prevent. Mesopotamian medical literature preserves extensive knowledge of life extension techniques presented within legitimate therapeutic frameworks. The diagnostic series, known as Sakiku, preserved across more than 40 tablets, describes physical signs indicating the presence or absence of divine life force within human patients. Physicians trained in these techniques could allegedly estimate remaining lifespan based on specific physical markers. Variations in eye color, texture of skin, patterns of hair growth, characteristics of the pulse. The prescribed treatments involved complex herbal preparations harvested during particular lunar phases, combined with powdered minerals believed to resonate with divine energy. These preparations were administered according to precise timing, based on astronomical calculations and individual patient characteristics. The physicians who practiced these arts occupied a distinctive position in Mesopotamian society, respected for their practical skills, regarded with a certain wariness for their more esoteric knowledge, trusted with an intimacy that few other specialists shared. They came into people's homes during the most vulnerable moments of life: illness, childbirth, dying. They saw what was hidden from public view, and in their more advanced practice, they were working at the boundary between what medicine could accomplish and what only divine intervention could address, which meant they were always negotiating, in their daily work, the same territory that the great theological dispute between Enlil and Enki mapped at the cosmic scale. Temple archives from Babylon preserve correspondence between physicians and priests regarding patients seeking life extension treatments. These letters reveal sophisticated understanding of the interaction between physical and spiritual factors in determining lifespan. Doctors consulted religious specialists to determine whether patients possessed sufficient divine favor to benefit from longevity treatments, while priests performed divination rituals to identify spiritual obstacles that might prevent successful intervention. The gradual loss of this medical knowledge paralleled the decline in human lifespans recorded in historical sources. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period contain detailed life extension protocols that later texts reference but no longer fully preserve. By the Neo-Assyrian period, physicians possessed only fragmentary understanding of the original techniques. This pattern suggests that the knowledge required to maintain extended human longevity was deliberately restricted over time, not lost through carelessness or cultural disruption, but actively suppressed, piece by piece, generation by generation, until only fragments remained, insufficient to reconstruct the whole. The loss of this knowledge was experienced by those who lived through it as a kind of darkening. Physicians of the later periods, who had access to the older texts, could see what they no longer understood, could read the names of procedures whose steps had been removed from the written record, could identify ingredients in ancient prescriptions without knowing how to prepare or combine them effectively. They were like someone who possesses a map to a buried treasure, but finds that the key landmarks have been removed. The map itself survives, proof that something was once there, but the path to it has been erased. Archaeological evidence from early Mesopotamian sites offers physical traces that may support accounts of unusual human capabilities in prehistoric times. At Eridu, the earliest temple levels contain architectural features designed for being significantly larger than modern humans. Doorways nearly 3 meters in height, with massive stone thresholds proportioned to accommodate individuals of extraordinary stature. Skeletal remains from pre-dynastic burial sites occasionally display unusually robust bone structure, large cranial capacity, and dental patterns suggesting extended lifespans. Metal objects recovered from levels dating to the 4th millennium demonstrate craftsmanship requiring sophisticated metallurgical knowledge, alloys that modern analysis struggles to replicate, suggesting access to technical knowledge subsequently lost. The oversized doorways at Eridu have attracted scholarly attention since their discovery, generating debate that has not been fully resolved. One interpretation holds that the dimensions reflect religious symbolism. Doorways made large to accommodate a divine presence understood as exceeding ordinary human scale. Another interpretation takes the physical evidence more literally. These doors were built for beings that were, in fact, larger than modern humans. The archaeological record cannot definitively choose between these explanations. But the fact that the earliest human structures at one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited sites were built to non-standard human proportions is, at minimum, a detail that resists easy dismissal. Cuneiform tablets from various sites preserve references to lost archives that allegedly contain the complete records of antediluvian civilization, detailed accounts of the original human creation, the techniques used to maintain immortal existence, and the mathematical foundations underlying both. The systematic nature of this knowledge loss appears in multiple independent sources, indicating something more like coordinated policy than random historical accident. Scribes maintained awareness of missing information even when they could no longer access the original sources, preserving titles and descriptions of lost text across centuries, like librarians cataloging books that had been deliberately removed from the shelves. The scribes who recorded these absences were performing an act of unusual intellectual courage. To note, in an official document, that certain knowledge had once existed and could no longer be found, to preserve the outlines of what had been deliberately erased, was to make visible the act of erasure itself. Whether this was done with full understanding of the implications, or simply out of the professional scribal commitment to completeness that required noting gaps as carefully as content, the effect was the same. The memory of what had been lost was itself preserved, outlasting the suppression that had targeted the original knowledge. The Tower of Babel incident, preserved in both biblical and Mesopotamian sources, represents the most significant post-flood attempt by humans to regain their original immortal status. Mesopotamian accounts describe the tower not simply as an act of pride, but as a sophisticated device for accessing divine energy sources. A cosmic collector built to precise astronomical alignments, incorporating divine metals and starstones into its structure, designed to restore human access to the immortality-sustaining power that had been severed after the flood. The divine response, rather than direct destruction, involved something more subtle and more lasting: the systematic dismantling of the common technical vocabulary that had enabled large-scale coordinated human effort. Without shared technical language, the knowledge preserved in oral tradition became inaccessible, and the connection between post-flood humans and their immortal predecessors' accumulated wisdom was effectively severed. The builders of the Great Tower were not naive. They understood the risk they were taking. The records of what had happened to previous attempts to regain divine capabilities were known to them. The flood itself, the systematic suppression of the mystery schools, the divine hunts that had eliminated the most enhanced graduates of those schools. They proceeded anyway, because the magnitude of what had been lost seemed to justify the magnitude of the risk. They believed that if they could build high enough, align their structure precisely enough with the celestial configurations that opened pathways between earthly and divine realms, they could reach back across the severance and recover what had been taken from their ancestors. They were not wrong in their analysis, only in their ultimate success. The preservation networks that survived these suppressions created intellectual currents flowing quietly forward through centuries, leaving their mark on the religious traditions that came after. The Hebrew scriptures incorporated structural elements from the Enuma Elish, while transforming its polytheistic divine council into a singular deity, who nonetheless uses plural pronouns, "let us make man in our image," preserving a trace of the original Anunnaki collective decision-making process. The Genesis creation account describes humans formed from clay and given the breath of life directly from the divine, mirroring Enki's creative process with precision. The Hebrew term nephesh, usually translated as soul, derives from roots meaning breath or life force, closely corresponding to the Sumerian understanding of divine essence embedded within human consciousness. The scribes who composed the Hebrew Genesis account were working in a world saturated with Mesopotamian intellectual tradition. The great cities of Babylon and Nineveh had libraries that any educated person in the ancient Near East knew about, even if they had never personally studied there. The stories, the structures of thought, the ways of imagining the relationship between humanity and the divine, these circulated through the learned communities of the region in the way that ideas always circulate, through trade, through diplomacy, through the movements of scholars and scribes, through the simple human tendency to recognize a good story and carry it forward. The Genesis flood narrative demonstrates even more direct borrowing, incorporating specific technical details from the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh flood account. The dimensions of Noah's Ark correspond precisely to those specified for Utnapishtim's vessel in cuneiform sources. The duration of the flood, 7 days and 7 nights, matches exactly what the Mesopotamian tablets record. The correspondences extend to details so precise that they could only result from direct textual transmission or extraordinarily faithful oral preservation. Early Christian theology incorporated Mesopotamian concepts through multiple channels: through Hebrew scriptures, through Greek philosophical traditions that had absorbed Babylonian learning, and through contact with mystery religions, preserving fragments of ancient esoteric knowledge. The concept of humans bearing the image of God corresponds to the Sumerian description of divine essence within human consciousness. The Christian emphasis on resurrection and eternal life represents a theological resolution to the problem of human mortality that Mesopotamian sources attribute to divine intervention. Gnostic Christian movements preserved more explicit connections to Mesopotamian cosmological systems, describing multiple levels of divine authority, cosmic conflicts between divine factions, and the human possession of a divine spark enabling transcendence of material limitation. The Gnostic teachers who elaborated these systems in the first centuries of the Common Era were, in a sense, doing what Mesopotamian mystery school graduates had done thousands of years before them, preserving and transmitting knowledge about the divine component within human consciousness in a form that could survive in a hostile theological environment. The specific names changed. Demiurge for Enlil, Sophia for a distorted Enki figure, Numa for Zeththirm, but the underlying structure of the cosmology remained strikingly consistent. Divine hierarchy, the creation of humans from both earthly and divine materials, the subsequent limitation of human capabilities by higher powers, and the possibility of recovering original divine status through specific knowledge and practice. These themes appear in Gnostic texts with the same persistence they show in cuneiform sources. Islamic theology similarly preserved fundamental concepts from ancient Near Eastern religious traditions. The Quranic account of human creation, clay formed and divine spirit breathed into it, maintains the essential structure of the Mesopotamian creation narrative. Islamic teachings about the Day of Judgment and resurrection reflect adaptations of Mesopotamian concepts regarding divine evaluation of human behavior and the possibility of restoring life to the deceased. The balance of divine mercy against divine justice corresponds to the theological tension between Enlil's harsh enforcement of cosmic law and Enki's protective advocacy for humanity. The Islamic philosophical tradition that developed during the Abbasid period drew explicitly on Babylonian astronomical and mathematical knowledge that had been preserved in Syriac translations from earlier Mesopotamian sources. The scholars of Baghdad, who translated Greek philosophy into Arabic, were also inheriting, through those Greek texts, the Mesopotamian knowledge that had flowed into Greek intellectual life through channels as diverse as Pythagoras' travels, Plato's engagement with Egyptian and Near Eastern sources, and the direct study of Babylonian astronomy by Greek mathematicians. The ancient knowledge moved through the world in complex, indirect paths, surfacing in unexpected places, transformed by each new cultural context through which it passed, but never entirely losing its original shape. Archaeological discoveries during the 19th and 20th centuries, the excavation of major Mesopotamian sites, the recovery of hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets, the decipherment of cuneiform writing systems revolutionized scholarly understanding of these ancient traditions and revealed the extent to which later civilizations had drawn upon Babylonian sources. Modern technological advances have deepened this understanding further. High-resolution photography combined with computer-enhanced image processing can now recover text from severely damaged tablets previously considered unreadable. Computer-assisted analysis of large cuneiform databases has revealed previously unrecognized patterns suggesting systematic encoding of technical information within religious and mythological texts. Recurring numerical relationships, linguistic structures, and symbolic systems appearing consistently across multiple text categories. The scholars who first deciphered cuneiform writing in the 19th century experienced something that their successors, accustomed to the existence of these texts, can no longer fully appreciate: the shock of discovery. These tablets had been silent for 2,000 years. The civilization that had produced them had been known only through brief and sometimes hostile mentions in other ancient sources. And then, suddenly, the clay spoke again. And what it said turned out to be not primitive mythology, but sophisticated theology. Not crude record-keeping, but complex literature. Not simple history, but philosophical reflection on the deepest questions of human existence. The scholars who first read these words were touching something that had not been touched in 2 millennia, and the weight of that contact was, by their own accounts, extraordinary. The systematic preservation efforts that maintained fragments of pre-flood knowledge through millennia of suppression created underground networks of transmission that scholars are still working to fully understand. Coded references appear in administrative documents, medical prescriptions contain unusual ingredients with no apparent therapeutic purpose, and astronomical calculations extend far beyond practical calendar-making requirements, all suggesting that forbidden knowledge was being preserved within apparently mundane texts, hidden in plain sight among the routine records of grain distribution and livestock inventory. The encoding systems used for this concealment were sophisticated enough to survive centuries of scrutiny by people who were actively looking for hidden materials. The scribes who designed these systems understood human cognitive tendencies. People searching for dangerous knowledge look for texts that appear esoteric, texts written in unusual formats or containing obviously symbolic language. They do not, as a rule, scrutinize the mathematical ratios embedded in grain allocation records. The choice to hide the most sensitive knowledge in the most apparently boring documents was a stroke of practical wisdom that proved extraordinarily effective. The Kanesh merchant archives discovered in the ruins of the Assyrian trading colony in modern Turkey, preserve correspondence that reveals the existence of knowledge networks operating across vast distances. Letters discussing seemingly ordinary commercial transactions contain terminology that makes no sense in purely economic contexts. Requests for the blue stones from the deep places, references to the old measurements from before the water, indicating that merchants served as carriers of forbidden knowledge between distant communities, using the cover of legitimate trade to maintain connections that official religious authorities would have suppressed if they had recognized them for what they were. The mystery school tradition that had flourished in the pre-flood world experienced systematic suppression in the post-flood era, but never complete elimination. Archaeological evidence suggests that several underground complexes discovered at Mesopotamian sites may represent the physical remains of hidden schools. Rooms with unusual acoustic properties, geometric floor patterns matching meditation instruction texts, ventilation systems designed to introduce aromatic substances into the breathing air. Carbon dating of organic materials found in these chambers indicates they remained in active use well into the Neo-Babylonian period, centuries after their supposed suppression, suggesting that the tradition found ways to survive even the most concerted efforts to destroy it. The students who studied in these hidden schools knew the risks they were accepting. Detection by divine surveillance agents meant elimination. Not imprisonment, not exile, but the permanent removal of the enhanced individual from the human community. And yet they came, generation after generation, drawn by the same quality of curiosity and divine yearning that had made their predecessors dangerous in the first place. The divine essence within them recognized at some level what it had once been, and it reached toward that memory with an insistence that neither fear nor prohibition could entirely extinguish. The role of temple schools in preserving esoteric knowledge extended beyond simple literacy training to encompass systematic instruction in encoded communication methods that enabled the transmission of forbidden information. Student exercises preserved at multiple sites contain mathematical problems that serve as training in the numerical encoding systems used to hide sensitive knowledge within routine documents. Advanced students learn to recognize the subtle linguistic markers, indicating when seemingly ordinary texts contained hidden meanings, requiring special interpretation. The advanced students who reached the highest levels of this training experienced a transformation in how they perceived the texts they studied. What had appeared to be straightforward administrative records revealed themselves as complex, multi-layered documents, each layer speaking to a different level of understanding. A grain distribution record became, simultaneously, a record of grain distribution and an instruction in the preparation of life extension compounds. An astronomical observation log became, simultaneously, a record of celestial positions and a calculation of optimal times for consciousness-expanding rituals. The world of written knowledge doubled in depth, and those who had learned to perceive both layers could never again see texts as simple, flat, unambiguous documents. The linguistic analysis of Sumerian religious terminology reveals multiple layers of meaning that become apparent only when texts are interpreted through the proper conceptual frameworks. Terms that appear to describe mythological events or divine attributes actually contain technical specifications for implementing consciousness-altering procedures or life extension techniques. The word melamu, commonly translated as divine radiance or terrifying splendor, incorporates root elements that refer to specific phenomena associated with enhanced human capabilities. A measurable quality of luminescent energy emission that could be quantified and manipulated through proper techniques. Mesopotamian metallurgical texts preserve detailed instructions for creating alloys that required techniques not rediscovered until modern industrial processes were developed. The procedures for producing what the tablets term divine metals involve temperature control, atmospheric manipulation, and timing requirements indicating sophisticated understanding of chemical processes. Archaeological analysis of metal objects from early Mesopotamian sites has confirmed the existence of alloys matching these descriptions. Compositions that modern metallurgy struggles to replicate, made by hands whose knowledge of the relevant processes exceeded what the historical record suggests should have been possible. The symbolic systems throughout Mesopotamian religious art and architecture contain recurring motifs that served as mnemonic devices for preserving technical information within visual representations. The winged disc symbol that appears across multiple cultures throughout the ancient Near East incorporates geometric proportions, encoding mathematical constants used in astronomical calculations and life extension procedures. These symbols function simultaneously as religious iconography and technical diagrams, a dual function that enabled crucial information to survive in visual form even when written texts were destroyed. Cylinder seals from various periods contain miniature versions of these symbolic systems, creating portable libraries of encoded information that could be carried by traveling initiates. The seemingly decorative patterns carved into these seals actually represent compressed versions of complex procedures, with each symbolic element corresponding to specific steps in technical processes. The widespread distribution of similar seal designs across vast geographical areas indicates the existence of standardized encoding systems that enabled knowledge sharing between distant mystery school communities, creating a kind of distributed archive that no single act of destruction could eliminate. Contemporary scholarly debates about these materials reflect fundamental disagreements that remain genuinely open. Traditional academic interpretation treats creation myths and divine council proceedings as literary constructions reflecting ancient attempts to understand natural phenomena through supernatural frameworks. Alternative perspectives argue that these texts preserve genuine historical memories, distorted through millennia of transmission, but retaining core elements of factual information. The most controversial interpretation, that Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki describe actual contact with technologically advanced beings from other worlds, is rejected by mainstream scholarship, which emphasizes that these sophisticated theological and philosophical systems represent the intellectual achievements of ancient human civilizations without requiring exotic external explanation. The debate itself is, in a sense, continuous with the ancient debates it concerns. The question of what these texts mean, what kind of reality, if any, they refer to, is not merely an academic question. It is a question about the nature of human origins, about what we are and what we might have been, about the relationship between the lives we currently live and the lives we might, under different circumstances, have lived. These are not small questions. They are, in fact, among the largest questions available to human thought, and it is perhaps not surprising that they generate disagreements as intense as the theological disputes they concern. What cannot be disputed is the enduring power of these questions. Whether the immortality described in Sumerian sources represents historical memory, mythological imagination, or prophetic vision, it addresses something that remains alive at the center of human experience: the longing to understand our origins, our limitations, and what we might still be capable of becoming. The clay tablets that preserve these ancient accounts, baked hard by the fires of time, outlasting the civilizations that created them, continue to speak across the millennia to anyone who is willing to sit quietly and listen. And what they say in the end is something like this: that you were made with care by beings who argued about your making and could not agree on what you deserved. That within you there is something ancient and luminous, something that was present at the beginning of all things and will persist after the forms it currently inhabits have dissolved. That the questions you carry about your own nature and purpose are not new questions. They are the oldest questions, the ones that were being asked before the first city rose from the river mud, before the first word was pressed into clay, before memory itself had taken the shape we recognize as human. You are not the first to lie in the dark and wonder what you are. You are part of a line of wonder that stretches back further than history can follow. The world that made these tablets is gone now. The rivers that watered its fields still run, but changed in their courses. The cities that produced its scribes are buried beneath centuries of accumulated sediment. The language that gave precise expression to the concepts of Zei and Immu and Melamu is no longer spoken by any living person. And yet here, in the quiet of this moment, those concepts reach across the distance between then and now, and find something in us that recognizes them. Not with the recognition of familiarity, they are strange to us in their specifics, but with the deeper recognition of relevance, the sense that these ideas are speaking about something we have always known, but have not had words for. The cuneiform tablets that preserve these ancient accounts serve as permanent witnesses to humanity's earliest attempts to understand our place in the cosmos and our relationship with forces beyond our control. Their message transcends specific religious or cultural interpretations to address universal human concerns about meaning, purpose, and destiny that remain as compelling today as they were when first inscribed in clay 5,000 years ago. The lost immortality they describe may represent historical memory, mythological imagination, or prophetic vision, but their enduring influence on human consciousness demonstrates the power of these ancient narratives to capture fundamental truths about the human experience that transcend the boundaries of time, culture, and belief. And now, dear friend, we have traveled far together through the corridors of ancient time. The Tigris and the Euphrates are quiet now in this imagined landscape of the deep past. The scribes have set down their styluses. The lamps in the tablet houses have burned low. Somewhere, in a room smelling of river clay and lamp oil, the last copy of an ancient story has been pressed into soft clay and set aside to harden through the long, still night. Let the names of gods and the long-ago light of forgotten stars grow soft and hazy at the edges of your mind. Let the great questions that these tablets carry settle gently around you, not demanding answers tonight, but simply resting here alongside you in the quiet, patient in the way that very old things are patient, comfortable with the long rhythms of time. There is nothing more required of you in this moment. The clay tablets will wait for another day. The questions they carry are ancient questions, and they will still be here when morning comes. Feel the weight of your body against the surface beneath you. Feel your breath moving slowly, in and out. The same breath that connects you to every generation of humans who has ever wondered what they are. The same divine warmth that Enki measured with his hands when shaping the first humans from Abzu clay. That warmth is in you now, in the living temperature of your body, in the quiet fire that keeps you here and breathing and present in this moment. Let your thoughts grow slow. Let them drift, as thoughts do in the space between waking and sleep, becoming less definite, less demanding, softer at the edges. The stars that the Borsippa priests watched so carefully are still overhead, moving through their ancient patterns, indifferent to the questions we ask about them, and yet, perhaps, carrying within their light some trace of what was embedded in the clay of the first humans. Some resonance of the long-ago moment when divine essence and earthly matter came together in a divine craftsman's hands, and the first conscious eyes opened onto the world. Sleep now, quietly and without worry. The ancient questions are patient. The old stories will keep. And you, carrying within you whatever trace remains of that original divine spark, you are safe and warm, and held within the long embrace of a history that extends further back than memory, and forward further than imagination can easily follow. Good night, and sleep well.